Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to another ECLA Online Learning session. My name is Martin. I'm the legal project manager at ECLA based in Brussels, and today is all about employment law and then COVID-19 in particular. And for that, we have a number of fantastic speakers all across Europe from CMS. Moderated by Melanie Lane, who is the partner and co-head of employment in the UK. I will give the floor to her, and then I would like to note to all our participants that questions can be asked in the chat box. So feel free to use it, and then we will come back to you shortly. So Melanie, the floor is yours. Melanie, we can't seem to hear you right now. Hello?
Hello? Is that any better?
Is that any better?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Wonderful. I do apologise. Sorry, I will start again. So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. As Martin said,
Melanie,
yes.
wait. There is an echo. I think you have two devices with the same sound.
Okay, apologies.
Yes, now we're good.
Is that better? Now I have muted the other line?
Yes.
Wonderful. I do apologise, everyone, for these teething technical problems. Hopefully that is okay now. Okay, so with apologies for that start, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. As Martin has said, my name is Melanie Lane. I'm the head of the CMS UK employment team, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to today's other speakers. The world has obviously changed very significantly in the last few weeks, and today we're going to be looking at some of the employment and labour measures that have been implemented across Europe to protect employers and businesses. I'm joined today by my fellow employment partners. First of all, Caroline Froger-Michon from France, Christopher Jordan from Germany, Katja van Kranenburg from the Netherlands, and Dulewitcz from Poland. We have all, as I'm sure many of you listening,
also have been extremely busy these past few weeks, analysing and advising on the best route for businesses to take through this crisis, and we'll be sharing our expertise and perspectives today.
Melanie, we seem to have an echo again.
Sorry. Hopefully that is better.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, so here is our content for today. We're basically going to be trying to look at various topics in a broad sense, with specific input from local specialists as we go. You will appreciate, unfortunately, we don't have anywhere near enough time today to cover every scenario for every country, but hopefully you'll get a good flavour and broad understanding of what's currently happening across Europe.
And if you do need more detailed advice, then of course we are happy to pick up on that separately. So I'm going to start with an overview of some of the emergency measures that have been announced and implemented across Europe. Then Katja is going to talk about redundancies and collective consultation with some
Melanie, I'm sorry, but there's an again. Wait, yes, exactly. I think.
I am sorry, Martin. The other line seems to keep unmuting.
Then I'm going to disconnect the other line if that's all right.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
So I'll leave the phone on. And then disconnect the computer.
Wonderful. Could somebody else please turn the slides for me? One of my colleagues.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you, Katja. So to continue, so as I say, Katja will talk about redundancies and collective consultation with some input from Caroline and Chris. Katja will explain some of the alternatives to redundancies that employers are or should be considering, with some input from Katja and Chris. And Caroline is then going to talk about businesses' people strategy during this extremely difficult time, again with some input from Chris on the longer term considerations. And finally, we should have some time for questions at the end, so please do put those into the chat box and we'll see if we have time to get to those. So on the next slide, starting to talk about some of the emergency measures across Europe. Now, this is, of course, an unprecedented situation, and certainly, at least from my perspective in the UK, we haven't seen these levels of state intervention since the end of the Second World War. Most countries in our continent are on some form of lockdown, with countries such as Italy and Spain, Hungary, enforcing this more strictly than in the UK and some of the Scandinavian countries. However, what is clear is that most employees are now, where possible, working remotely, but businesses, unfortunately, are still suffering hugely, and we don't know how long the economic consequences are going to last. I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview and sort of highlights of some of the measures that are being put in place across Europe. I would note, however, these are very fast changing and in some cases quite complex. So obviously always more detailed advice would be needed. But just to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the measures that are being put in place. I'm going to take this alphabetically. So starting with Austria. Austria has introduced temporary short-term working arrangements that basically allow the employer to agree between a 10 and a 90% reduction of working hours, but with reimbursements from the state to cover much of that lost wage. And in addition, holiday has also been provided for those who need childcare, albeit schools are still open for those who can't provide childcare. In Belgium, if contracts are suspended for force majeure reasons, then employees can receive 70% of their wages, or about €2,750 per month, until the end of June. Also, cash flow support is being provided there through the tax system. In the Czech Republic, the government has introduced a specific antivirus scheme, which provides support of between 60 and 100% to employees who can't work for a variety of different reasons, from quarantine to site closure. Much of this amount is recoverable from the state, and measures have also been put in place to support self-employed people. In France, various legislation has been introduced to vary entitlements to paid leave and sick pay. And in addition, employers can seek a special indemnification from the state to cover short-term working arrangements. Chris will be talking about that in more detail later. In Germany, there's been an extension of the short-time working regime. Again, Chris will go into that in more detail later. Also, the government is providing subsidised leave of about €2,000 a month for parents who can't work due to school closures. In Italy, a short-time working scheme has been introduced, allowing compensation for 80% of lost wages where the business has been affected by COVID-19, and also significant additional childcare support arrangements in place there. In the Netherlands, where a business has suffered a loss in revenue of 20% or more, it can apply for a subsidy of up to 90% of the wage sum. Katja is going to share more details of that later on in the webinar. Poland has introduced a range of measures, including the option to reduce employees' salaries by 50% due to the economic downtime, or to reduce working time by 20%, in both cases with government subsidies. Portugal has introduced a 3-month programme allowing employers to suspend or reduce working time if there's a 40% drop in revenue, with 2/3 of pay being covered by the state. Romania's got a similar state compensation scheme covering 75% of earnings, and it has also introduced a paid leave entitlement for parents when neither are receiving compensation from their employers. In Spain, there's a right to suspend contracts due to force majeure following a maximum 7 days consultation, and employees are allowed to claim benefits as a result. In Switzerland, the existing short-time working arrangements have been extended, and 80% of lost wages will be refunded by the government. In Turkey, there is a short-time working allowance available until the 30th of June. In the Ukraine, also a short-time working system has been introduced just this month, with the state meeting 2/3 of the lost wages, and that's capped. And then finally, my own jurisdiction, the UK, here the government has announced a specific coronavirus job retention scheme that encourages businesses to put employees on furlough instead of making redundancies. a new concept of furlough that has been created over the last few weeks for us here in the UK. That system basically allows companies to claim 80% of wage costs, or £2,500 a month, for an initial period of 4 months. Self-employed people who earn less than £50,000 a year are also entitled to claim broadly the same benefit. And we also have here new rules on statutory sick pay and holiday carryover, and a new right for employees to take emergency volunteering leave. Now, that is a bit of a whistle-stop overview, but hopefully that gives you something of a flavour of the sort of measures that are being introduced across Europe. I would emphasise we will soon have available later on this week an online guide to many of these jurisdictions, and we're happy to share the details with you if you'd like to delve into the detail on some of those countries. But in the meantime, I hope that was, as I say, a useful overview, and I will now hand over to Kasia to talk about redundancies, collective redundancies in Poland.
Okay, thank you, Mel. I would like to cover now redundancies, just the general rules in EU, and then specifics in some CE countries. But as a general thing which I see across CE, we don't think clients are now moving into group redundancies. Everyone seems to try to keep headcount and just save on the costs. And think that COVID is temporary. We all believe in that. But anyway, some businesses are starting group redundancies, and mostly those which were planned already before COVID. So let's see for the general rules, in case you also suffer to use this tool. There is a general EU directive on group dismissals, and that provides for some similarities in most of the CEE and the European countries. And the EU directive on group dismissals, you have to apply in case within 30 days, in most cases, you dismiss a number of employees. So we don't count B2B contracts or freelancers, we just talk about employees. And the thresholds are similar across Europe, with some small differences. So in EU countries, if you plan to dismiss 10 employees and the company is headcount over 100, below 100 employees, then you have to follow with the procedure. If your headcount is between 100 and 300 employees, then 10% of redundancies would trigger the whole process. And then if you are a large company employing over 300 people, it's the procedure would need to be applied if you dismiss over 30 employees within 1 month. There are some countries, a limited number, where you calculate the headcount differently. And if you try to dismiss 20 people within 90 days, that would also trigger the whole process. I think what's important is people sometimes miss that mutual agreements or settlement or compromise agreements, however we call them in different jurisdictions, also count for the redundancies. And in case you're going to conclude at least 5 of them, then you would have to also fall within the process and count them within the full headcount of number of people who are making redundant. The whole process can take a long time, and for example, in Poland, the whole procedure would take up to 5 months to clean the whole headcount and try to save on the costs. What is important in the whole procedure, you have to consult your employees or trade unions, and that differs in various countries. Chris will talk more about Germany, where there are really strict rules on this. But for example, in Poland, you just negotiate for 20 days. And if within 20 days you will not reach an agreement with your unions or with representatives of employees, then you can go with the redundancies, and the lack of agreement will just not stop the whole process. So if we go and dive down into local countries, into local jurisdictions, because I was just describing in general rules, I think there are also some small changes in each country in case you look at the statutory severance amount, which you pay at the redundancy. So in most CE countries, being EU members, including also Poland, you pay the statutory extra severance pay up to 3 months' salaries. But for example, in Hungary, or you pay 6 months salaries, and in Slovakia, you pay the severance of up to 5 monthly salaries. We do also count Russia and Ukraine in CE, but these are not EU countries, so they have different rules and they don't have to follow the EU legislation. Although Ukraine has quite a similar concept and similar thresholds to the whole EU directive, they just have an additional one threshold that if you plan to dismiss 20% of your employees during 3 months, you have to apply the whole procedure. But in Russia, there are completely different thresholds, and you apply a special different procedure if you dismiss 50 people within 30 days, 200 employees within 60 days, or 500 employees within 90 days. So that's it from my part. I'm happy to answer any the questions even on chat, and then I move to the next slides and hand over.
Thank you, Katja. Well, in the current context, several countries have implemented measures aiming at protecting employees against dismissal. And as you said, for the time being, we have not seen many redundancy plans being implemented. Well, this is probably because most countries encourage businesses to use support measures in place rather than implementing redundancies. And we will discuss this later on, especially with Chris and Katja. But others have taken even more severe measures to actually prevent terminations. In Italy, for instance, the government stated that no one will be left alone and no one will lose his job. That is why a specific decree provides for an absolute ban on dismissal for economic reasons, whatever the number of contemplated dismissals. Therefore, procedures initiated after the 23rd of February are now suspended until May 17th. Some countries have decided to subject the benefit of state aids to the employer's commitment not to dismiss employees. This is notably the case for Spain, where companies having benefited from state aids cannot dismiss for a 6 month period following the resumption of activity. In the Netherlands, the NOW compensation, which will be further described by Katja, will only be granted if the employer commits not to initiate dismissals for economic reasons during the period for which the compensation is received. Similar provision exists in Portugal. Likewise, in Poland, if the company asks for subsidies, then it will not be allowed to conduct redundancies while receiving said subsidies and for the following 3 months. In Bulgaria, employers must retain employees for a period equal to the period for which the compensation is paid by the state. In France, the government first suggested that dismissal for economic reasons would be prohibited. This idea was eventually dropped. However, the Labour Ministry indicated that it is highly recommended to postpone dismissal plans, and the ministry further stated that authorities will closely monitor social plans which would be launched now. In any case, even if it is not clearly prohibited by local legislation, implementing dismissal in the current context can in practice be rather difficult due to the situation. Indeed, in all countries where a pre-dismissal meeting or a notification by registered letter is required, current situation makes it very difficult, if not impossible. I will now hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Caro. Yeah, as Caro has just described, in Germany, for example, we don't have any dismissals with regard to or due to the corona crisis. So in Germany, most employers who are hit by the crisis make use of state-subsidized reduction of working time. We call it short-time work, and I will be discussing this in a few minutes in more detail. At this point, I would really like to point out that in Germany, even if you implement short-time work, that means even if employers make use of state subsidy, there is no restriction on redundancies. That is very different from many other countries, what Caro has just described, where you would either have a ban on dismissals, or if an employer makes use of state subsidies and then dismisses employees, the employer would have to pay back state subsidies. That's actually not the case in Germany, much to my surprise and to others' surprise. So, however, at this point, I would like to discuss some practical challenges during the Corona crisis with regard to dismissals. And that is related to the obligation of the employer to consult and negotiate redundancy measures with employee representatives. As Katja has described, in all European member states, the employer has to some extent, inform and discuss with the Works Council planned measures with regard to reduction of workforce. In Germany, if these consultations with the Works Council fail, a statutory arbitration procedure has to be done before actually terminating employees. That's the so-called Einigungsstelle. That's a German term. And if the employer fails to do so, if the employer fails to inform and consult with the Works Council, if the employer fails to kick off this statutory arbitration procedure, the employer cannot implement the redundancy measure. And here now there comes the challenge in this time where many businesses are closed down or people work from home. And there is, let's say, social distancing like all over the place. It's just to some extent impossible for the employer to actually facilitate these kind of negotiations and procedures, which makes it for the employer to some extent impossible to implement staff reductions at this point. So in the different EU member states, there have been some attempts to solve and to address this issue by allowing, let's say, virtual meetings of Works Council on on Works Council decision making, and to allow virtual negotiations between employer and employee representatives. In Germany, for example, we have an official statement of the German Minister of Labor, of the German Federal Secretary of Labor, according to which virtual Works Council decision making should be accepted during the Corona crisis in order to protect health and safety of employee and employee representatives. However, this is just a statement. That's just the opinion of the German Secretary of Labor. It will be not binding. So in the moment, if in a company negotiations with the Works Council are being conducted by video conference, for example, and at the end of these negotiations, there is a Works Council decision based on a video conference, for example, there is a significant legal risk that this decision would be considered invalid. However, it is not clear yet how courts will decide in these cases. So our recommendation would be, let me switch to the next slide. Our recommendation would be to have a video conference at least, and to ask the Works Council to have a video conference when deciding on a redundancy project, not just the telco. Of course, the proper invitation has to be done, like the same invitation process that applies with regard to physical meetings. All participants during that video conference need to have the chance to be connected simultaneously. So there must be a discussion must be possible. So you cannot choose a platform or format where some people can speak and other moderate and can assign speaking rights. That would not be okay from our point of view. Of course, all participants need to agree on the format of the video conference, which can be done during the video conference, according to our opinion. And it needs to be guaranteed that the decision-making of the Works Council, the video conference, is actually a non-public platform. So third parties cannot participate or listen or something like that. However, at the end of the day, you still have to keep in mind a Works Council decision on a restructuring, for example, needs to be somehow translated into a written agreement. So at the end of the day, you will need something in writing. So even if you have a video conference with the Works Council on on a redundancy project, at the end of the day, you will need to exchange something in writing in many European member states, at least in Germany. That's it for the moment. Katja, would you please continue with other alternatives to redundancies? Katja?
We can't hear you, Katja.
Hi, Katja. Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Okay. Hi. I'm going to tell you indeed about the alternative. Let me see how to solve that. Does it work now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Now it's much better, yes.
Okay, very good.
Yes.
Sorry. Alternatives to redundancies. And I will also tell you a little bit about the emergency bridging scheme that has been introduced a couple of weeks ago in the Netherlands, and also a very interesting development that was announced yesterday evening. And I think in general, we can say that one of the conclusions of this Corona crisis situation is that governments in many countries are coming up with emergency legislation almost every day, which is challenging definitely for you, if you are in HR, to keep a good oversight of what is happening and how to anticipate to almost daily changes. So if there is no good reason to make people redundant, because what we also see is that employers indeed think that this is a temporary situation and that at some point in time, maybe slightly later than we anticipated in the beginning of the crisis, you will need your employees and you will need to be able to quickly adapt to the new situation. And that is why we see that many of our clients are not as much focusing on redundancies, but on other measures that will allow them to increase their liquidity and to keep their workforce as much as possible at the same level. What we have seen, what is interesting, is that in the Netherlands, for example, employers have decided, if new employees were about to enter into the employment, that if there was a probation period, the employment was ended under reference to the probation period. Whereas in France, that is explicitly not allowed to do so, to use the probation period due to Corona and terminate an employment agreement before that has started. What we also see in workforce adjustments, it's a little bit a combination of the topic on changing roles, is that employers are reaching out to other employers to see whether they can exchange employees. If there are some industries where there is no work and also not an idea when that work can start because of measures of the governments, we see that in some industries, employers are reaching out to other sectors and reaching agreements on seconding their employees to other industries, which obviously is only possible if there is a good match with experience and skills. But we see that happening more and more. Many employers have reached out to us in many jurisdictions whether it is possible to temporarily lower wages. In the Netherlands and in many of the jurisdictions around us in Europe, that is usually only possible if with the consent of the employee. And in some countries, it is also necessary to engage the Works Council. And in the bigger, more traditional industries, trade unions are involved. We have seen in a couple of jurisdictions, especially in the Netherlands, trade unions being willing to agree with employers that salary cuts are made or that payments of holiday allowance traditionally in the Netherlands in the month of May or June are being suspended based on the promise that if and when the economy is better and the economic situation of the company also improves, these payments will be made later on in the year. We have also seen that many companies have decided not to pay out bonuses at all or delay payment of bonuses. And the bonus element comes back in the additional rules in the Netherlands for companies that want to apply for state subsidy, which I will share a little bit about later on. We have seen in a couple of jurisdictions that because of the corona crisis, governments have implemented new legislation which enables employers to oblige employees to take paid holidays, especially if the activities of the organization are cancelled because of a shutdown or other reasons where it is impossible to continue to work. For example, in Austria, there was a new law implemented where the employer, if there is no work to be done, can force employees to take a couple of weeks paid holiday. Same applies for Belgium. It is possible, if collectively agreed, to impose employees of taking paid holidays. In the Netherlands, that is not possible. It is only possible if it has already been included in a collective bargaining agreement. And we do see many employers in many industries, especially those who are not able to provide work for employees, on a voluntary basis, ask employees to agree with taking leave. And the general feedback we get from that from employees is that the majority of the employees is willing to do so. From a Dutch perspective, it is always very helpful to engage your Works Council, even if there is no legal obligation for the Works Council to give advice or consent for these changes, but it creates a better arguments for the employer to more or less impose those measures on employees. Other questions that come up almost on a daily basis, especially because we're now going into, well, the beginning of a summer holiday period, is that employees have already agreed upon their vacation days in the coming months, but foresee that traveling will not be possible and are asking their employers whether it is possible to revoke the request for a holiday and maybe take the holiday later on. There is no legislation on that. There is case law that says that under circumstances, the employer must comply with a request from the employee to revoke earlier holidays. But in general, the employer is not obliged to comply with that. And we see that employers who are suffering very much financially usually are not eager to agree to employees revoking days holiday. At the same time, we see that the combination for employees working from home, taking care of children, still having enough work to do from home, it's at the same time these employees also value, even if they are at home and not fully free to do whatever they would like to do before the corona crisis, still value to have a couple of days or even maybe weeks of holiday to recuperate and then again continue work. Changing roles, I already said something about it very short, that we see more and more industries discussing with each other the secondment of employees. We have also heard about employees wanting to volunteer in the health industry to be supportive. In the UK, for example, you could take a statutory unpaid leave, and while the regular benefits would remain in place, in the Netherlands, you are, of course, if you're not able to work, allowed to volunteer in other industries, but safety and health first, because in the Netherlands, if an employee becomes sick, there's the obligation to continue pay for 2 years, and therefore some employers are very reluctant to agree for their employees to volunteer in a healthcare facility. Then shortly about another alternative to redundancy, when you look at it from a Dutch law perspective, there is indeed a subsidy employers can apply for if they foresee that they will suffer a loss of turnover of 20% or more in a 3-month period. The subsidy could even go up to as high as 90% of your wages, and individual wages are capped at 9,500 euros, which is a very high amount. It is indeed extremely disencouraged to make employees redundant, because there is a penalty afterwards if you would do that. Yesterday there has been a new announcement which is relevant for companies in a group structure. In principle, if the company in the Netherlands is part of a group of companies, you can apply for the subsidy. Only the level of subsidy is dependent on the loss in the whole group, the loss of turnover. As of yesterday, that has been changed. If the group suffers a loss of less than 20% and the individual operating company suffers a loss of more than 20%, this operating company is allowed to apply for the subsidy. However, the promise needs to be made at a group level that you will not pay dividend, that you will not pay any bonuses, that you will not buy back your own shares. And this is a new addition to this scheme to be coming into effect in a couple of days. And the subsidy scheme in the Netherlands is until the 31st of May of this year. It is expected that it will be extended for a couple of months, starting 1st of June. And it is also clear, because there was a clear message from the Minister of Social Affairs yesterday and from the Prime Minister, that going forward for companies that want to apply for the state subsidy, they will all need to make the promise of not paying dividend within the group structure, not paying bonuses. And we see immediately that that could be also a difficult obligation for companies to meet, which could at the same time also mean that it is no use to ask the state subsidy if it limits company on a global level too much. I would like to hand over the slide to Chris.
Thanks, Katja. So we have already discussed that there are all different kinds of state subsidy schemes in place in Europe. We have put together in our group an online tool, and we call it e-guide, that summarizes the different state subsidy schemes, and we are going to publish it, I think, at least at the end of this week. So that will be interesting, and I hope you can all make use of that. We already had a question on a summary of state subsidy schemes, and so there will be an online tool available in this regard. The mechanism differs very much from country to country. I would like, as it is a German invention, so to say, I would like to discuss the concept of short-time work a little bit. So when we talk about short-time work, and it's probably a poor translation of the German term Kurzarbeit, when we talk about short-time work and when we talk about this concept, we refer to a decrease of normal working hours, which is state subsidized, that allows the employer to decrease the normal working hours and to pay only the wages that reflect the reduced amount of hours worked by the employee. In some member states, employers can even reduce the working hours to 0, like, for example, in Germany and in Austria, which effectively results in a complete suspension of work. So as a result, that the whole salary or salary replacement is paid by the competent authorities. And as I said, this scheme, this idea of short-time work has its origin in Germany. It's actually more than 100 years old. It was heavily used in the 1920s, 70s, and 80s. And during the financial crisis 2008 and 9, the German instrument model became so popular that the EU actually agreed that all member states should have something like short-time work. And the OECD recommended it because Germany had only experienced a very small increase of unemployment during the financial crisis. And that is basically the reason, of course, behind this instrument. It's to prevent unemployment. So various European countries have such instruments like Austria, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden. There are other state subsidy schemes. So, for example, the temporary unemployment model needs to be differed from short-time work. Temporary unemployment you would find in Belgium and Finland, for example, and based on this temporary unemployment scheme, employees are temporarily laid off and they receive benefits directly from the authorities, from the state, not via the employer. So these are, to summarize, these are the main differences between the different concepts of state subsidies addressing a subsidy of wages. I would like to briefly discuss the typical requirements of short-time work based on the German prerequisites. So the prerequisites of short-time work are basically that you would have to show to authorities that there is a certain percentage of employees affected by a temporary loss of work or working hours. And this loss of work cannot be prevented. In some countries, it is called force majeure. And this loss of work results in a loss of earnings, of course. So that's the typical requirements, so to say. In all European jurisdictions, there are some formal requirements with regard to notification of the authorities, of course. And also in most European countries, there is a requirement of negotiation with Works Council representatives or individual agreements. So if, for example, you have a Works Council or other form of employee representation in Austria or Germany, short-time work can only be introduced if you have an agreement with the Works Council on the implementation of short-time work. If you don't have a Works Council, for example, in Germany, in fact, you might have to ask for the employee's consent to introduce short-time work. And this should be really taken seriously, because if short-time work is introduced without sufficient legal basis of the employees, then the employees might claim their full contractual wage, irrespective of whether they have worked a reduced amount of hours or not. So make sure there is sufficient legal basis for short-time work before you implement. So now, due to the corona pandemic, several European states have just lowered the requirements, and I would like to give you some flavor in this regard. And I'm very sorry, there is way too much text on these slides, but we will circulate later on, so you will have the chance to read later on. I would just like to highlight some of the most important updates. In Austria, for example, due to the corona crisis, the short-time work has just been amended in a way that it allows employers to reduce working time to zero, which was not the case before the corona crisis. In France, for example, due to the corona crisis, short-time work, the maximum duration had been extended from 6 to 12 months. So it used to be 6, and due to corona crisis, the government said, well, that will probably not be sufficient. We will extend until for a period of 12 months. In Germany, we have several changes. So, for example, you do not need to show as an employer that 30% of your employees are affected by the loss of work. Only 10% need to be affected due to the latest update of the legal provisions. And just to show you how hard it is to summarize actual developments, just today, actually during this webinar, I received information that the German coalition, the German government, has decided to increase the subsidy from currently 60 or 67% to 80%. So this is actually brand new, that has been decided actually this morning. What else? You can see that on the charts that in Italy the system is unfortunately very complicated because it's subject to collective agreements, and there are different funds that apply for different groups of employees depending on the union, depending on the question of which union is competent. So this is some kind of very high-level summary of the let's say Western and South European developments. And my partner Katja Dulewitcz from Poland will now be discussing the situation in CEE a little bit more in detail. Katja?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Sorry, I was just typing an answer to Axel on chat to answer some questions, but happy to cover CEE now. Right, so on the CEE, most countries had not developed in the past short-time work, but recently we remedied the situation, and most of the concepts are similar to German ones. So we're following the German concept. And there are two similarities in CEE across all CEE countries. The first one is that there is a restriction to dismiss employees, and Caroline was talking about this in more details. And the second similarity is that governmental subsidy is provided for up to 3 months. That's the usual way, and we'll see if it's going to be extended. On things which are different, please bear in mind that in some countries you have to prove the turnover drop-off. Like, for example, in Poland, you have to prove 15 or 25%, depending how you calculate, of drop-off in the turnover, just to apply for the subsidy. Similarly, will be in Bulgaria. In other countries, like in Hungary or Ukraine, you just have to prove and present some economic circumstances which would allow you to apply for the subsidy. Let's see the more details. You will see a table on how CEE, some selected countries, implemented the short-time work. And maybe just to pick Poland, not to cover all countries. In Poland, you can decrease salary by 50%, or you can decrease the working time of your people who are coming to work of up to 20%. And I think what's interesting from the practice, we had many questions from the clients, whether people who are on sick leave or people who are sent on holidays, whether they can still, whether the subsidy can still cover the absence. And there is a lot of discrepancy around this in the country. But finally, the interpretation is that, yes, you can still send the person to take holidays, which is, again, a common thing across sea, as we see, and then still receive the subsidy for such a person. And the other country, which is maybe worth to touch upon, and is Czech Republic. I think in Czech Republic, if we have a drop-off in working time across the CEE, there is the maximum state contribution capped at the level of €1,000, which is it's still not 9,000 like Katja was saying in Netherlands, but I see across the whole CE countries the level of cap per employee is between €150 to €500 in Poland and 1,000 in Czech Republic, and we're not exceeding this per one employee across the whole CE. So thank you. That's it for my side, because we just left with nine minutes. So I'm happy to chat with you on the chat if you have specific questions on specific countries. And I can hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you. I think I will try to be short here because we are running out of time, but we would like to talk about immediate consideration in people management. Because basically current working conditions are unique and no one was actually really prepared to face them. Let's start with those working remotely, as it appears that most countries are clearly encouraging work from home whenever this is possible. And to be frank, it seems that this situation is likely to last more than expected initially. However, this might raise difficulties for companies and employees who are not used to such a massive use of remote work. On one side, employees must organize their work, adapt their home to work efficiently, and sometimes even manage this with homeschooling, which can be quite a challenge. And on the other side, managers face two issues: find a way to ensure successful continuation of business while keeping a close eye on each employee, because ultimately employers' obligations remain the same. On this particular point, it is very important to underline that employers remain subject to their duty of care with respect to employees' health and safety, even if they are working from home. In particular, in most countries, rules governing work-related accidents remain applicable. This means that any accident occurring while the employee is working from home will be considered as a work-related accident. In this respect, one should pay particular attention to mental health and well-being. More than ever, the current situation creates social isolation, which can in turn favor two types of issues. First, burnout cases. Indeed, when working from home, employees might have more difficulties to maintain proper work-life balance, be tempted to be constantly connected, and work more than usual. Some studies already report that most employees working from home currently have more stress than usual, especially if they are not enjoying proper conditions to work remotely. Second, specialists say that work from home makes it difficult for people to stay away from addictions such as drug or alcohol. With this in mind, we would like to give you a few practical recommendations. Basically, there are 4 rules that managers should follow to handle the situation. First, set a general framework. This might sound obvious, but the employer must make sure that all employees has the necessary equipment to work. It is also very important to ensure connectivity between staff. Then you must define clear guidelines. In this respect, it is important to specify clearly time slots during which the employee can be reached and define a work program which must be adapted to the employee's seniority. Second, employers must trust employees and leave them the time they need to organize themselves. The change of working condition was really brutal, and this might take more time for certain people to get used to it. Indeed, the ability to get comfortable with work from home really depends from one individual to the other, irrespective of age, position, or seniority. Third, As a team leader, the manager must maintain a social link with employees, but also between them. Using programs such as Skype, Zoom, or Teams offer the possibility to chat and organize conference calls. It is key to organize regular one-to-one and collective conference calls. In some companies, employers even impose the use of video during conference calls, not to control employees, but to maintain the social link between them. Sometimes these programs are even used by employees to enjoy a daily coffee break. Finally, it is key to keep an eye on employees' workload. In this respect, it is essential for the manager to follow each individual's to-do list, to share information, and to be available to help employees in their work. It is indeed key to support employees to help them going through this difficult period. It is essential for now, but also for the future. Moreover, giving proper feedback is more than ever necessary, not only to protect your employees, but also to protect the company against further litigation when normal times come back. Let's now move to the situation of employees who cannot work remotely. Depending on their position and job, some employees still have to go to work to perform their duties. And in the current context, many HR reported their employees generally fear to come to work. Therefore, these employees must benefit from specific attention and protection considering the high risk of contamination. Here again, we would like to give you a few practical recommendations. As already indicated, the employer is subject to a general duty of care with respect to health and safety. Therefore, in the present context, the employer must ensure that the workplace is safe. This means communicate and display the official recommendations, notably those provided by the WHO, clean the workplace and even sanitize in case of high risk of contamination, limit physical meetings and contacts between employees. Therefore, open plans, company restaurants, and more generally, any collective spaces in the company where employees might gather should be reorganized. This means also paying a particular attention to certain employees who may need extra protection. In several jurisdictions, specific measures are provided to protect employees suffering from existing illness and who are therefore more at risk in case of infection by COVID-19. For instance, in France, a specific leave was created for this category of employees, and from May 1st, these employees will automatically be put on short-time work. In the UK, vulnerable employees are not eligible to statutory sick pay, but the government advice is to consider whether these employees can work from home. If not, authority provides that highly vulnerable employees are eligible to access to furlough. This is the case for employees suffering from specific type of cancer, severe asthma, or other listed conditions. For the moment, the situation is not clear for other vulnerable employees, such as employees over 70 or with long-term health condition. Finally, it is necessary to provide additional safety equipment when the employee's position or duties imply contact with public. This is in particular the case for so-called critical workers, i.e. employees of grocery stores and all employees of the medical sector. These workers are clearly exposed to a high risk of infection. Considering the necessity to protect them and to take into account the value of their job, several countries have implemented specific measures. In the UK, for example, specific custody arrangements have been implemented for the children of these essential workers, and furthermore, an employee may take a special leave called EVL to act as an emergency volunteer in health and social care to reduce the pressure on these essential services as a result of COVID-19. Other countries have already announced that workers who must continue to go to work will benefit from a bonus. This is the case in Italy, for instance, and more recently in France. Let's now move to the situation of employees who cannot work because schools are closed. Indeed, most European schools are closed. Some are due to reopen in the coming weeks, but others will be closed until summer. To deal with this, most countries favor work from home, obviously, but when work from home is not possible, other solutions must be found. For instance, in Germany, parents who are unable to work will be entitled to an indemnity representing 67% of their income, and subject to certain conditions, such as the fact that parents do not have other reasonable childcare option, said indemnity will be paid for 6 weeks maximum and is limited to a maximum monthly amount to 2,016 euros. In Poland, an employee who stays at home to personally take care of his child up to the age of 8 is entitled to a care allowance amounting to 80% of his compensation, and this measure has been extended to April 26. Without going into too much details because we are running out of time, I would like to mention that there are also specific arrangements for parents in France, in Italy, and in Spain. This is what we wanted to share with you today with respect to immediate considerations. For sure, things will evolve and be adapted, especially for countries who will hopefully start exiting their lockdown in the coming weeks. I will now hand over to Katja. Katja? We can't hear you, Katja.
Hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Very short as we're running out of time, but the short term and the long term. What we see on short term is really companies.
Katja, you're on echo.
Oh, sorry. And now better?
Yes, I muted one of your ones, so now it's good.
Okay, good. Short term, we see, of course, companies looking for additional state aid that is being provided. We have also seen that companies, the many jurisdictions, are being allowed delay in payment of taxes. And for the short term, the majority of the questions has come from employers that want to create a little bit more room in their liquidity and to see what measures are possible, including what are the obligations to that. As Caroline said just now, that in some countries the schools are opening carefully. Same applies in the Netherlands, although it has been said at the same time, even if the schools are going to open in a new way, still people are very much encouraged to continue to work from home. What we also see is that in many of the European countries, shops are opening, people are allowed to maybe even already go to hairdressers and have a little bit more room to visit other places than their own homes. And many of the repetitive questions that come up there are, on the one hand, the health and safety of the employees, because with more people visiting your store or your location, it could be more difficult to guarantee also the health and safety for your own employees. And what we also see particularly is the need for companies to have a better and a very practical understanding what kind of questions related to the coronavirus, who have you been in contact with, and the GDPR are coming up more and more. Questions about, can we measure the temperature of our employees? Can we measure temperature of people visiting our building? In general, it is not permitted to, as an employer, measure the temperature of employees, but you can arrange for a contact with a company doctor or a nurse to do that for you. And we see an increase in those questions. And we have prepared an overview about these kind of questions, which will be happily shared with you. On the long term, what we see as the subsidies are likely to be continued is that also the additional conditions are being extended and changed. What I just said, if you want to apply for state subsidy in the Netherlands, you are not allowed on a group level to pay bonuses or pay dividend. Another additional rule is that if you want to apply again for state subsidy, you need to agree with trade unions that you will not make people redundant, which is even more strict than the current rules and arrangements. In term, looking at the time, I'm handing over the slide, which would mean that we would now come to the additional questions Q&A.
First and foremost, thank you for all of you for presenting this extremely topical discussion in a very interesting manner. And then I'm going just through the chat box now. It seems that some questions have already been answered, but I think for clarity's sake, I'm just going to go through them one by one, and then just talk about the answers that you provided during the session as well. So if we start from the very top, I saw, so we had Olivier from Paris asking, how is the right to disconnect working right now in countries like France? And then the answer to that was by Caroline, who said that right to disconnect remains more than ever applicable, even during times like this. There was also a question from Axel, that do you expect a harmonization of the legal framework for short-time work within the framework of European legislation? Would it be useful to include clauses on the scope and duration of short-time work in the employment contract so that the employee's consent is not required in the event of short-time work? And then we had Katja highlighting that such clauses in employment contracts wouldn't be enforceable because you cannot agree in advance the exact timing, and she wouldn't see a unilateral decision of the company to work as a trigger for it. And then Chris also added that he doesn't expect any harmonization soon because the schemes are so different and there isn't the political will to follow just one model either. And then also, I mean, for the speakers, if you would like to add anything to the already asked questions, then feel free to let me know as well. And then we had Karin asking for Poland whether terminated employees can be rehired in the future, and whether collective redundancies can be avoided as well. And then is there any risk in relation to the termination? And Katja from Poland essentially answered that people who are made redundant can be claimed to be rehired within a year, so 12 months, and then come back to work in case your company rehires within the same positions. Let's see. And then we had a question about pre-booked holidays and carryover, whether employees are still obliged to take them. And then that varies across jurisdictions. So in Poland, for example, you can only force people to take old holidays, not the current ones. With their consent, of course, it is possible, and it is a trend across CEE, based on the experience of the speakers. Let's see. We have a bunch of thank you messages, and then thank you for our participants as well. And let's see. I think that is it with the questions. I mean, there is a lot of discussion here, but I think that most questions got answered during discussion already, unless some of our audience members have any additional questions.
I think we're just happy to cover any questions over the email as well. So I think we covered everything now.
I have a feeling as well. So essentially, I mean, as mentioned, you can always contact the speakers via email, and then I think so we will be sending out the presentations to all our participants, and the email addresses are there on the PowerPoint as well. So feel free to contact them directly if you have any additional questions about the employee law. From my side, I would like to give a huge thank you for everybody from CMS for joining us. Employment law is at a vital stage at the moment. It's not that often that law has to evolve at such a rapid pace as it is right now. So from my side and from ECLA, a genuine thank you to all of you, and then thank you for all the participants for joining us. We will be resuming with our sessions next week, so please visit our website at ecla.eu for the latest schedule. Registration is always free, and then hopefully see you again next week. Would the speakers like to say a few finishing words?
Thank you, Martin. It's Caroline. Just to mention that on this last slide, you can see what we are writing and producing at CMS Employment Group. We have a special Learn Now program, but also we have this special COVID page on our website, so people can visit those pages and website to get additional information. Thank you.
So thank you once again, and then best of health to everybody, and hopefully see you again in a week. Until then, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.